Hello. In the previous video we looked into the idea that terrorism is becoming increasingly deadly. And in this video we're going to explore the assumption that terrorism is predominantly anti-Western. This assumption can be broken down into two parts. First, we are going to focus on the targets. Are the targets of terrorism mainly Westerners, or are they not? And then we will look at rhetorics. Is the language or are the slogans of terrorists mainly anti-Western? Where does the assumption come from, and what is the origin of the claim? Well, President of the United States, George W. Bush, hinted at it in a speech which he delivered about 10 days after the attacks on his country in 2001. And in his speech, or his address to the nation, he said the following: Americans are asking, why do they hate us? And he said, they hate what they see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other, thus hinting at an anti-Western idea or an anti-Western agenda. And there are many interviews with Osama bin Laden, the then leader of Al-Qaeda, that are proof of an anti-Western idea, an anti-Western agenda. In an interview with Al Jazeera in 2002, for instance, he stated that the priority in this war at this stage must be against the infidels, the Americans and the Jews who have not stopped their injustice, according to Osama bin Laden. But also scholars and experts have pointed at anti-Western talk and anti-Western terrorist attacks. One of them is Walid Faris, who wrote several books about what he calls jihadism or jihadist. And the author describes and analyzes through multiple examples of terrorist groups and individuals how jihad was waged. And it was a war against the West in his eyes, an ideological war against Western civilization and democracy. Some have argued that this anti-Western jihadist terrorism, also known as Islamist terrorism, is a new type of terrorism. Martha Crenshaw, for instance, in a book published in 2000, stated the following. She said, several recent works focus on a new terrorism that is motivated by religious belief and is more fanatical, deadly and pervasive than the older and more instrumental forms of terrorism the world has grown accustomed to. She also shows that this new terrorism is described as anti-Western terrorism originating in the Middle East, that is linked to radical or fundamentalist Islam. And in the same book, which was published before 9/11, Martha Crenshaw also noted that alarm over the emergence of radical Islam was heightened by a combination of factors, the resort to suicide bombing in Lebanon and Israel, a general willingness to inflict mass civilian casualties, and anti-American, anti-Western targeting and patterns, according to Martha Crenshaw. Why is it important to test this assumption? If we continue to believe and continue to say that terrorism is predominantly anti-Western, of course we will strengthen this perception. But what if it's not true? What if terrorism isn't mainly aimed against the West? Then spreading the idea of anti-Western terrorism is not very helpful. In fact, in that case we will help those who would like to threaten the West, and we will make some anti-Western groups a lot bigger than they are. Moreover, we might contribute to the notion of a clash of civilization as put forward by Samuel Huntington. Or we might strengthen this idea of a clash or struggle between Christianity and Islam. Again, this is not a good idea when the facts do not support such a clash or such a struggle. Those kind of frames might, for instance, influence the way we look at each other, the way we look at individuals from different cultural backgrounds. It can lead to generalization and stereotyping. And, for instance, in the West, it could lead to a situation where some people might see their Muslim neighbor as a potential anti-Western person, or even worse, as a potential enemy. And that is why we have to compare this assumption with facts. Is terrorism predominantly aimed against Westerners or not? Or is it only rhetoric, only empty threats? Well, regarding the threats, it should be mentioned that there have been many calls for terrorist action against the West. There's no denying possible many threats. I already mentioned Al-Qaeda, which is of course one of the most important ones, but there are many other groups as well. More recently, it is especially the so-called Islamic State, also known as Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, that is making headlines, partly with threats against the West. But what about the facts on the ground? Do these groups mainly target Westerners? Do they mainly target the West? Well, there are many different ways to answer that question. Let us first look at the map and take a geographical approach. Well, here is a map of terrorist incidents based on the Global Terrorism Index 2015 that measures the impact of terrorism. We see that the regions that suffered the most from terrorism are not in the West. The West is confronted with relatively low levels of terrorism. Look at North Africa, South America, Western Europe, Australia, and compare that with the figures and colors in the Middle East. Compare it with Iraq, South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and parts of Africa. Mainly Muslim countries are faced with terrorism. Also in North Africa, Nigeria, mainly the northern part of that country. And also Russia has been confronted with a lot of terrorism, but it's also mainly one particular part, the Caucasus region, the Muslim populated part of that country, that suffers the most. So not the West actually, the Muslim world is most often confronted with terrorism. And who are being killed in these attacks? In all of the countries mentioned, the overwhelming majority of the victims are Muslims. And there are many sources that confirm this, and the data are striking. Well, here you have the figures of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, their report on terrorism 2015. And this report shows that 74% of all death due to terrorist activities took place in 5 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Syria and Pakistan, of which only Nigeria does not have a Muslim majority. And other sources show that even in Iraq, in the years after 2003, meaning the years after the US-led invasion, when there was an enormous presence of Western troops, the majority of the attacks by Al-Qaeda affiliates, including what is called today Islamic State, was against fellow Muslims, not against Western troops. So the rhetoric may be predominantly anti-Western, but the victims are Muslims, not Westerners. And what about the situation in the West? The few attacks in the West, are they perhaps predominantly anti-Western? According to Europol's Terrorism Situation and Trend Report 2016, there were 151 deadly victims in the European Union in 2015. And with the exception of one, this was the result of 3 separate terrorist attacks by religiously inspired groups. That's the political correct term for Islamist or jihadist terrorism. And these were the attacks in Paris in January 2015 against the weekly Charlie Hebdo and a Jewish supermarket, and the attacks in Paris of November 2015 and the attack in Copenhagen by a jihadist lone actor or lone perpetrator in February 2015. And the report by Europol also shows that there were in total 211 attacks, and they were mainly carried out in the United Kingdom, France and Spain. And most of these attacks, failed ones, foiled ones, a few completed ones, were carried out by terrorist groups that are called separatist or ethno-nationalist groups. Thus we have a situation in which most attacks cannot be labeled anti-Western, but that 3 out of 4 deadly attacks were conducted by jihadist groups and individuals with a clearly anti-Western agenda. What about North America? What about the United States? Well, according to the data of the Global Terrorism Database, there were 3 deadly attacks. One anti-abortionist attack, one by a person with a jihadist background or more persons, the San Bernardino shooting, and one case in which a student with jihadist sympathies tried to kill one student with a knife before he was shot dead by university police. To sum up, the rhetoric of much of today's terrorism is anti-Western, but its victims are not. They're not Westerners, they're Muslims. And combining these 2 observations, we label the assumption that terrorism is predominantly anti-Western false. And in the next video we will investigate the idea that terrorism is successful.